This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. How often do you think about your soap? Well, if you answered, not much, maybe you should. You see, a lot of what passes for soap in stores is technically not soap, according to the FDA's definition. It's full of lab-created chemicals and detergents because, well, it's cheaper to make. Now, what if you could buy natural soap made from natural ingredients like tallow, palm oil, coconut oil, and scented with essential oils, and for just a little more than you'd pay for grocery store soap? Sterling Soap is 100% natural, and with a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne, there's a product and a scent for just about everybody. Check them out for yourself at sterlingsoap.com. That's STIRLING soap.com.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Darren Hayes, host of the Pigskin Dispatch and Jersey Dispatch podcast. I hope you've enjoyed another great episode here on Sports History Network. Now, speaking of sports history, this episode was brought to you by Firefly Books, and they have two great ones for you this summer. For basketball fans, they have the NBA 75, the definitive history by author Dave Zarum, who's appeared on our Jersey Dispatch podcast recently. He tells about the experience, the thrilling journey of the NBA, from its humble beginnings to its modern glory. Uncover the untold stories of triumph, controversy, and the greatest stars of the game. This isn't just a book. It's courtside seats to over 75 years of NBA history. And for the golf enthusiasts, swing into The Golf Round I'll Never Forget by Matt Adams. Relive 50 of golf's most memorable moments through the eyes of the legends themselves. From Garcia's triumph at the 2017 Masters to Nicklaus' miraculous 1986 comeback, it's the closest you'll get to walking the fairways with golf's greatest. Get your summer read on. Grab a copy of NBA 75 or The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, available online or at your favorite bookstore.
This is Basketball History 101 with Rick Loayza.
Welcome back to award-winning Basketball History 101, part of the Sports History Network. I am your host, Rick Loayza, and this is the podcast where we bring to life some of the forgotten stories from basketball history. We are bringing old school basketball to a new school audience. And today we bring you the story of the 1972 Olympic gold medal game between the United States and the Soviet Union. Munich, Germany was hosting the Olympics that year, and they wanted to put on a great event in order to show the world that they were no longer the same country that started 2 world wars. And they accomplished that goal. The Germany of 1972 could not have been a more stark contrast to the Germany that hosted the Olympics in 1936. Just 5 days before the Olympic gold medal game, there was a tragedy at the Olympics where Israeli athletes were kidnapped and murdered by terrorists. So there was a sadness and a darkness that settled over the remaining days of the Olympics. As for basketball, it came down to the United States and the Soviet Union, who were bitter enemies and rivals in every sense of the word. I remember growing up in the 80s when the Cold War was still a thing. As an American, we were raised to look at the Soviets as the bad guys. They were the evil empire, according to President Ronald Reagan. And when the two countries competed against each other in any competition, it was a game of life or death. It did not matter if it was a game of checkers or Monopoly. If the competitors were from the United States and the Soviet Union, then it was national news. Americans wanted to defeat the Soviets in everything, and I'm very sure that the Soviets felt the same way about the United States. Anytime that the US defeated the Soviet Union, it meant that our nation and a democratic system was superior. Or, if the Soviets won, then it meant that their nation and the communist system was superior. It was not just a competition between two nations, but a competition between two different systems of government, two different political ideologies, two different ways of life, and two very different agendas. Losing was simply not an option for either team in a situation like this. For the Soviet athletes, it was not just embarrassing to lose to the United States. I mean, the shame would be bad enough, but often the athletes would be kicked off the national team and then often forced into a lifetime of hard physical labor. The athletes would be stripped of every advantage and benefit that they may have enjoyed. as members of the Soviet national team. Losing to the United States meant having a very horrible rest of their lives. So the Soviet athletes were motivated to win. Going into that 1972 Olympic tournament, the United States had never lost a single Olympic game before. They had been undefeated since basketball became a medal sport in 1936. They had won every gold medal in the sport ever at the time of this game. Going into the game, the United States had a perfect record of 63 victories against 0 losses in Olympic competition. The game started, and the Soviets had a player by the name of Sergei Belov, and he was wonderfully talented. He, along with many of his teammates, had played in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. In fact, the Soviets were 8 years older than the Americans on average. The American players were 19, 20, or 21 years old. The Soviets were 27, 28, or even 29 years old. The United States used university players because of the amateur rules still in place for the Olympics at the time. The NBA players could not participate because they were clearly professional basketball players. However, the Soviets listed their players as soldiers since they were all officially members of the Soviet Red Army, meaning that they were technically amateurs when it came to basketball because they were paid as soldiers, not basketball players. Anyway, the Soviets took an early lead in the game and the Americans were being outclassed. The Soviet maturity and experience with the international rules gave them a huge advantage. The Soviet players had played close to 400 games together as a team, while the American players had only played around 12 games together going into that Olympic match. The game began with an intensity that was so heavy and thick that you could cut it with a knife. The more experienced Soviet players took a quick lead of 8-4. The Americans had a hard time getting in front. The halftime score was 26-21 in favor of the Soviets. The Americans were going to need to make some serious adjustments if they wanted to win that gold medal. The second half started and the Americans were starting to close the gap. That is when things started to get a little ugly. The Soviets sent in Mikhail Korkia to start a fight with Dwight Jones, the leading scorer for the United States. Both players were ejected, and the Soviets got the better end of that deal. The Soviets lost a bench player, and the Americans lost their leading scorer. And just 1 minute later, Alexander Belov purposely injured Jim Brewer during a free throw, but the referees did not catch it. They just saw Brewer go down and did not know why. Brewer was unable to continue playing because the injury was that bad. The Americans had just lost 2 starters, while the Soviets only lost a bench player. And the game continued with fierce intensity. With 10 minutes left in the game, the Soviets had a 10-point lead and it seemed like they had full control of the game. However, the Americans began to use a full court press and were able to close the gap to a single point with just 38 seconds left on the clock. In the next sequence, Alexander Belov made an ill-advised pass and Doug Collins stepped into the passing lane and stole the ball. He streaked down the court for a layup. He leaped into the air for that layup with just 3 seconds on the clock, and Zurab Sakandalidze pummeled Collins on the side of the head, and Collins went flying into the basket support so hard that he was unconscious for a few seconds. The American coaches exploded, demanding that Sakandalidze be ejected. In today's NBA, it would have been an immediate flagrant 2 call and an ejection. But back then, in that situation, the referees just called a regular foul, and Collins had 2 free throws coming. American assistant coaches Johnny Bach and Don Haskins were trying to figure out who should take the free throws for Collins because Collins was clearly knocked out and unlikely to continue. But head coach Hank Iba said that if Collins got up and could walk, he would take the free throws. After a few seconds, Collins did regain consciousness with the bruise already swelling up on his face. He was woozy and dazed and needed a second to compose himself. But he stepped to the line with just 3 seconds left on the clock and calmly made both of those free throws. The Americans were now up 50-49. The Russian coaches were then screaming because they had been signaling for a timeout and the referees were not giving it to them. You see, according to the rules of the day, if a team wanted to call a timeout during free throws, they had to call it before the second free throw. And then the referees would make note of the call and then a timeout would take place immediately following that second free throw. But according to Doug Collins, the referee had already handed him the ball for the second free throw, meaning that it was now too late for the Soviets to call for a timeout. Once the free throw was taken, the Soviets would have to inbound the ball and continue play with no timeout. They would have to inbound the ball and go the length of the court to make a basket. Again, in just 3 seconds. But the Soviets were arguing that they clearly signaled for a timeout prior to the second free throw, but that the referee missed it in all of the excitement that was going on. So, according to the rules, the referee handed the ball to the Soviets and told them to inbound the ball. One of the Soviet coaches ran to the scorer's table and demanded the timeout, but the ball had already been inbounded. So, no luck for the Soviets. But with 1 second left on the clock, the referee suddenly blew his whistle to stop the game. Nobody knew what was going on because the ball was inbounded cleanly and no foul had occurred. Bill Jones, the head of FIBA, the International Basketball Federation, came down from his seat to the scorer's table, and he instructed the referees to give the Soviets their timeout and then replay the final 3 seconds of the game. The referees clearly stated that this was against Olympic rules. They could not legally replay the final 3 seconds, but this was their boss in a sense. These referees were employees of FIBA, and this was the head of FIBA telling them to replay the final 3 seconds. Now, this is something that needs to be said clearly. The head of FIBA has no authority over any individual game at the Olympics. From the time the game starts until the time the game ends, the head of FIBA is just a spectator like everyone else. So despite the resistance from the referees, they listened to their boss and informed both teams that they were going to replay those final 3 seconds. Now, the really weird part about this is that the two referees did not speak English or Russian, and they did not speak each other's language. They were having trouble communicating with each other the entire game. So they gave the ball back to the Soviets for attempt number 2 at winning the game. What they did not notice was that the Soviets had made a player substitution that they were not allowed to make because that timeout that they were arguing for had never actually been granted. But in all of the chaos and the arguing, the Soviets had well over a minute to gather and discuss and make a substitution. The Soviet players gathered around their coach, who drew up a play for them while the referees were still sorting everything out. The ball was inbounded, but because of the American defense, the shot by the Soviets was off and bounced away from the rim. The Americans were celebrating and even ran to the locker room to start the festivities. But again, the head of FIBA stopped everything and demanded that the game be reset and that the last 3 seconds of the game get replayed again. The clock was never reset properly for attempt number 2. This was in the days before digital clocks. In today's basketball, the scorer's table would just put 3 seconds on the clock and be ready to go. But back then, they had an analog clock with hands. The clock would have to be rewound and let the hands of the clock count down to 3 seconds, where they would stop the clock at the 3 second mark and considered it reset. But as attempt number 2 was inbounded, the clock was sitting at 50 seconds and only ran down to 47 seconds. This was deemed improper and another attempt needed to be made. Have I mentioned that the head of FIBA had no authority to demand this? So they had to get the Americans to come back from the locker room, and this was utter confusion everywhere. The fans were confused, the referees were confused, the players were confused, and rules and procedures were being broken just to make this all happen. So once everyone was ready, they set up for attempt number 3 at winning the game. The clock was finally reset properly and everything was ready to go. The referee with the ball was waving his hand at Tom McMillan of the United States. McMillan thought that he was being instructed to back up, which he did. But the referee was really saying was that he only needed to stay behind the imaginary plane that represents the baseline. Scared to get a technical foul, McMillan backed all the way up to the free throw line and was essentially guarding nobody. This allowed for a clean inbound pass. The ball went the length of the court to Alexander Belov. Belov was challenged by Kevin Joyce and Jim Forbes of the United States, who also leaped for the ball. But as all 3 men came down, the Americans both lost their balance and fell over, leaving Belov by himself underneath the basket with the ball. He gathered himself and made an uncontested layup for the victory. The Soviets had done it. They were the first team to defeat the United States in an Olympic game. The Soviets began hugging and jumping around celebrating their gold medal. They would be heroes back home in the Soviet Union. They would have privileged lives as the players that vanquished the Americans. They would get promotions back home, better housing, extra food, and higher quality food. They would even have access to nicer clothes and better shoes. They might even get an apartment with a private indoor toilet, a real luxury in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Americans were confused. How could this happen? How could the Soviets be given 3 chances to score a winning basket? They were so incensed at what had happened that they decided that they would not accept the silver medals. And they didn't. When the medal ceremony took place, the Russians were there to accept their gold medals, and Cuba was there to receive the bronze medal. But the second place podium was completely empty, and the Americans did not come out for those silver medals. Even today, in 2025, those silver medals are sitting in a safety deposit box in a bank in Switzerland. None of the 12 players have ever taken their medal, and many of those players have even put it in their wills that their kids are not allowed to accept those medals. Those medals will sit in that bank for the foreseeable future. Back in the Soviet Union, that final pass for the game-winning shot is known in Soviet basketball as the Golden Pass. In 2008 and in 2012, Doug Collins was one of the broadcasters for Olympic basketball for American television. In both of those Olympics, the United States won the gold medal, and both times the players all went straight for Doug Collins. They shook his hand and he said, "This is for you," and the rest of the 1972 team. Kobe Bryant really knew the history since he had known Doug Collins since he was a kid. Kobe's dad, Joe Bryant, was teammates with Collins on the Philadelphia 76ers. And in both of those Olympics, Kobe would go over to Collins after the medal ceremony and take a picture with Collins wearing the gold medal. And that meant everything to Doug Collins. Well, that is it for today. That is the story of the 1972 Olympic gold medal game between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the controversy surrounding it. Join us next time when we share another story from basketball history. That's next time on Basketball History 101, part of the Sports History Network, the headquarters of Sports Yesteryear. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com to find out more about this and other sports history podcasts. If you like what you hear, please hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcast. And check out our page on Facebook. It's called Basketball History 101 Podcast. There you will find short historical posts, and I'll also announce there when new episodes come out. I want to thank my producer and editor, Jacob Loayza. Join us each week as we continue to mine the history of basketball for more great stories in the past. Take care, and see you soon.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The Sports History Network, where legends live on and the past plays loud. Welcome to the place where history's proud. From gridiron glory to the hardwood stars, from the racetrack heat to Olympic bars. It's the voices, the stories, the moments you miss, told by fans and pros who live for this. Hook and Themic, the Sports History Network, where the past comes alive. Podcasts and blogs that keep the flame high. From Babe to Brady, Alley to the Dome. If it's history and sports, then this is the home. SportsHistoryNetwork.com, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.